Kendrick Robinson stepped through the courthouse doors with brisk purpose, the click of his polished shoes echoing against the marble floors of Greenville's municipal court. His breath was still catching up with him after the sprint from the federal building. He'd been deep into a high-profile human trafficking case, the kind that consumed every moment and ounce of energy when the reminder popped up on his phone. His appeal hearing for a property tax reassessment was starting in 5 minutes. He barely had time to grab his files. Now he was here, straightening his tie, pushing through fatigue, and trying to get into the right mental frame for a very different kind of case. But he was late. 5 minutes late. As he entered the courtroom, the sound of a gavel striking wood sliced the air like a gunshot. "Mr. Robinson," Judge Whitman's voice thundered from the bench, stern and seething, "your disregard for this court is unacceptable. $750 fine. Pay it today." The words hit Kendrick like a slap. He froze for a moment. There had been no inquiry, no chance to explain, no grace offered. Just the punishment, swift and public. He took a breath, willing his expression to remain neutral. But his eyes flicked across the courtroom, scanning. A young white woman had slipped in after him. He'd seen her come in, tapping on her phone. She hadn't even looked up when the bailiff asked for quiet. Her presence drew no rebuke. Further down the aisle sat a man with a wrinkled blazer and an open briefcase who had shuffled in after Kendrick. No fine for him either. Only him. Only Kendrick. He knew the pattern. He'd seen it enough to recognize it instantly. He wasn't just a man who'd arrived a few minutes late. He was a black man in a tailored suit, standing before a judge who had already formed an opinion. The courtroom's silence pressed down on him like a weight. He walked quietly to his seat, every step deliberate, every breath measured. He opened his folder, not to the paperwork for the property tax appeal, but to a clean sheet. He pulled a pen from his pocket and began writing, documenting everything. The judge's tone, the room's reaction, the subtle glances between the court clerk and the bailiff, the discomfort in the air. He knew what this was. It wasn't just about a fine. It was about power, about whose mistakes were overlooked and whose were punished. It was about the subtle levers of injustice, cloaked in procedure and protocol. His mind wasn't on the appeal anymore, not really. It was here, in this room, on the weight of every silent moment that passed, on the shifting glances, on the fear some people wore like cologne when a black professional stood up and asked questions. He listened to the cases before him with sharpened ears. One after another people approached the bench, and one after another the judge rendered decisions with a veneer of impartiality that cracked the more you watched closely. The white defendant who forgot his paperwork was gently reminded to bring it next time. A smirk accompanied the judge's words when a young man joked about his parking ticket. There was leniency, laughter, but only for some. When Kendrick's case was finally called, he stood slowly, not as a man seeking a favor or forgiveness, but as one who had come for something deeper, clarity, maybe even a reckoning. He walked to the center of the courtroom with steady steps. He didn't raise his voice, didn't falter. "Your Honor," he said, his tone respectful but firm. With respect, were the rules enforced equally today? The question hung in the air for a second that felt like an hour. The courtroom froze. The clerk looked up. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Judge Whitman's expression darkened. "You're out of line, counselor," the judge barked, slamming the gavel once more. Kendrick didn't flinch. He simply inclined his head and held the judge's gaze. He had been called worse, endured worse. He didn't raise his voice again. He just stood there, letting the silence speak for itself. Finally, he gathered his materials and turned to leave. He wasn't angry. He wasn't defeated. He was resolute. Behind him, a law student sitting in the back row, young, unsure, eyes wide with the revelation of what she'd just witnessed, mouthed the words, "Thank you." He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and walked out. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows over the courthouse steps. Kendrick paused, standing in the light. His mind wasn't on the $750 fine anymore. That was a footnote. What mattered now was the notebook in his hand, where he had recorded the small truths that added up to something far bigger. He knew the importance of evidence, of documentation. He'd built cases on it. And now he was building something new, not in a federal courtroom, but right here, in the everyday cracks where justice faltered. The fine, the glare, the unequal enforcement. It was all part of the same story, a story as old as the courtrooms themselves. He walked slowly to his car, each step filled with thought. The courthouse wasn't just a building of justice, it was also a mirror reflecting back the values of those who sat in judgment. He'd held the mirror up, if only for a moment, and in that moment something had shifted. Days later, Kendrick returned to his office, the fine paid, the appeal set aside. On his desk were files for cases that mattered deeply, victims depending on him to navigate a broken system, children rescued from traffickers, families shattered by addiction and poverty. But among the stacks sat the folder he'd carried that day. He opened it and reread his notes. Each word was clear, precise, unemotional but heavy, the kind of record that, given time, could open eyes, could stir a conscience, could become part of something larger than one man's frustration. That evening, he spoke at a local university's law seminar. His topic was courtroom procedure, but midway through, he paused. "I want to share something that happened to me recently," he said. "I walked into a courtroom 5 minutes late, got fined. Others didn't. And when I asked why, I was told I was out of line. But if asking for equality is out of line, then the line needs moving." There was silence, and then applause, not loud, not boisterous, but real, thoughtful. A professor approached him afterward. "You just made some of these students rethink everything they believed about justice," she said. Kendrick smiled, but there was sadness in it too. "Justice isn't an idea," he said. "It's a practice. It has to be lived. And right now we've got too many people performing it, and not enough people demanding it." Back at home, he set his folder beside his other notes, cases, briefs, depositions. This one was different. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about something deeper, a call, a responsibility. He wasn't just a prosecutor, he was a witness. To the disparities, to the glances, to the assumptions that governed so many quiet decisions. And being a witness meant telling the story, even if his voice trembled, even if it cost him more than $750. In the weeks that followed, he noticed something subtle in courtrooms around the city. Some judges became more careful with their words, clerks more alert to inconsistency. Law students, when they interned, started taking notes like he had. Quiet ripples, small shifts, but real. One day, he received an envelope. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. A typed message. "I was there that day. I saw what happened. I always thought fairness was natural in court. I didn't understand until you asked that question. Thank you for opening my eyes." He folded the note and placed it in his folder. Some days, Kendrick wondered if anything ever really changed, if speaking up made any difference at all. But then he remembered the look in that law student's eyes, the quiet message, the long pause before the applause. He remembered that justice wasn't a destination. It was a journey, a fight, a daily act of courage in rooms that weren't built for fairness. And so he kept walking into courtrooms, kept showing up, kept speaking when it counted, because the law could only serve justice if people like him demanded it did, and because silence in the face of disparity was never an option. The email Kendrick sent wasn't long. It was only a few paragraphs, but each word had been chosen with the weight of years behind it. He attached a PDF, scanned notes from his courtroom visit, along with citations from the federal code. He didn't embellish or accuse directly. He simply described what he saw, what he had documented, what he could no longer allow to pass in silence. He sent it late at night, just before turning off the light in his small home office. He didn't expect fireworks. But the next morning, everything changed. By dawn, federal investigators were stepping onto the marble floors of the Greenville courthouse. Their dark suits and stern faces announced something the sleepy town hadn't seen in years: accountability. They moved with purpose, straight to the clerk's desk, flashing badges, demanding logs, dockets, financial records. Miss Thompson, the court clerk for nearly 30 years, sat at her desk with trembling hands. She had always known. She'd seen the imbalance, the patterns. She knew which files were flagged with whispered comments, which defendants never stood a chance. And tucked away in her drawer was her own secret, a small, spiral-bound notebook, yellowed with age, margins filled with years of coded notes. She didn't hesitate. She slid the notebook across the table. "Everything's in here," she said softly. Inside that worn little book was the truth that Kendrick had suspected. Fines issued to black defendants were, on average, 3 times higher than those for white defendants facing similar charges. Patterns emerged with cruel clarity: warnings for white latecomers, threats or penalties for minorities, cases where leniency was routinely granted to one group and withheld from another, and every margin told a story, short, cold, coded, a system exposed in shorthand. When the investigators interviewed the bailiff Wilson, the silence finally broke. He was a large man with thinning grey hair and a voice that had always boomed when enforcing courtroom order, but that day it cracked. He looked down at his hands as he spoke. "I've seen it for 15 years, he admitted. The difference in tone, in treatment, in who got second chances. I just never had the courage to speak. I told myself it wasn't my place, but it was." His confession was recorded, and from that moment the dominoes began to fall. Meanwhile, outside the court, something unexpected took root. The law student who had mouthed "thank you" to Kendrick that day had posted a short Twitter thread the night before, recounting what she'd witnessed. She had described the scene, the fine, the unequal treatment, the question Kendrick asked that no one else dared to, and ended with a single sentence: "He spoke truth to power, and I'll never forget it." The post exploded overnight. Hashtags like Equal Justice, Now, and Gavel Watch began to trend. And the thread didn't stand alone for long. A wave of others followed, stories pouring in from across the country. A single mother fined $500 for a broken tail light, while her neighbor, who was white, had been let off with a verbal warning. A Latino teen jailed for skipping school, while his white counterpart had been sent to community service and counseling. The flood of stories pulled the curtain back further. News vans arrived in Greenville. Cameras lined the courthouse steps. Commentators debated systemic bias. Civil rights attorneys flew in. What had started as a quiet injustice had erupted into a national reckoning. Journalists dug deeper into Judge Whitman's record. They found the statistics, the disparities, the language. Quotes from old transcripts where certain defendants were described as reckless or unrepentant, while others were deemed young and misunderstood. The double standard was clear. It had always been there, hidden in plain sight. Then came the apology. Judge Whitman, pale and trembling, stood at a podium. The courthouse steps behind him framed the scene like a theater set. His voice was low, rehearsed. He spoke of regret, of unintended harm. He used words like miscommunication, lack of awareness, and oversight. But they rang hollow. The reporters didn't buy it. Neither did the community. Because behind closed doors, while the cameras rolled outside, Judge Whitman was in his chambers shredding files, literal pages of records fed into a machine with frantic urgency. But it was too late. Copies had already been taken, statements already given, and Kendrick had already passed the documents to the Federal Commission. The evidence was no longer his. It belonged to the truth now. Back at his office, Kendrick stared at a spreadsheet of data: names, dates, fine amounts, ethnic backgrounds, case types, row after row of disparity. The deeper he looked, the sicker he felt. This wasn't about one bad judge. It wasn't even about one courtroom. This was a system built to appear blind, but trained to see in color, and what it saw shaped the outcomes of thousands of lives. He couldn't look away, not now. Then his phone rang. "Kendrick," the voice on the other end said. It was someone from the commission. "They're voting tomorrow. Whitman's resigning." Kendrick said nothing for a moment. He looked across his office where a frame hung on the wall. Inside it was the receipt for the $750 fine, still crinkled, stained from the courthouse copy machine. He had framed it not as a badge of honor, but as a reminder. A single moment, once humiliating, that had sparked all this. Was it a trophy? No, it was proof that even small acts of courage could open a wound wide enough to let in light. He hung up the phone without a word. That night, he went for a walk. No briefcase, no tie, just himself. The air was thick with summer heat. He walked past the courthouse steps now draped in protest banners, past the mural someone had painted of balanced scales, one side bearing a judge's gavel, the other a raised fist. He stopped and looked at it for a long time, not in pride, not in anger, but in reflection. This was never about revenge. It wasn't even about Whitman. It was about every silent observer, every Miss Thompson with a hidden notebook, every Wilson who had waited too long to speak, every young student watching and learning. The next day, the news broke. Judge Whitman had resigned. The court released a statement, vague and cautious, citing personal reasons and ongoing inquiries, but the city knew, and so did the country. Kendrick didn't hold a press conference. He didn't issue a statement. He simply went back to work. His job remained the same, prosecuting cases, seeking justice. But something had shifted. When he walked into courtrooms now, people looked up. Not in fear, not in resentment, but in awareness. Judges were more measured, clerks more attentive, and the law students, they were watching everything, taking notes, asking harder questions. One afternoon, a young attorney approached him in the hallway. "Mr. Robinson," she said, her voice full of nerves, "I just started practicing and I saw what you did. I want to be like that, to not be afraid." He smiled gently. "Then start by noticing," he said. "Don't just study the law. Study how it's used, who it helps, who it harms, and when you see the pattern, don't look away." She nodded, eyes wide with determination. As weeks turned into months, the federal investigation expanded. Greenville's court system began a review of all past sentencing and fines. Cases were reopened, some sentences reduced, others expunged. A new judge was appointed, a woman known for fairness, for transparency. She introduced training programs, accountability audits, and regular reviews of sentencing patterns. Kendrick was asked to help lead a committee on bias in the courtroom. He accepted, not because he needed the recognition, but because the work was far from over. He thought often of the 750s, of how much that day had cost, not just in money, but in emotional toll, in the risk of speaking up. But it had bought something greater, a conversation, a spark, a shift, and even if it faded with time, even if the system pushed back, as systems often do, he would still be there, notebook in hand, eyes open, voice steady. Because justice didn't bend on its own, someone had to push. And Kendrick Robinson had learned that sometimes the smallest push could bring the whole facade down. The courthouse steps had never seen a crowd like this. That morning, long before the sun had risen high, they were filled, shoulder to shoulder, with people who had waited far too long to witness a change. Some stood in silence, others chanted with voices full of fire, reporters clustered near the base of the stairs, cameras perched like birds waiting to capture every angle. Protesters raised signs that cut through the rising tension. "Justice blind? Open its eyes." The voices weren't angry for the sake of noise, they were voices of people who remembered, people who had lived in the shadow of a justice system that had often failed them. And now they had come to see what it might look like to start again. Inside the building, the air carried a different weight. The courtroom, once ruled by a man who punished late arrivals and overlooked privilege, was about to witness a new era. Judge Marisol Ortega stood in front of the bench, hand raised as she took her oath. She was calm, her voice unwavering, her history well known. a Latina woman with a reputation for reform, transparency, and fairness. Her record was not about how many convictions she'd overseen, but about how many lives she had given a second chance, how many policies she'd helped reshape. Kendrick stood among the audience, his heart steady but full. He didn't smile for the cameras, didn't cheer with the crowd. He simply watched. Watched as the gavel passed to someone who understood its weight. Watched as the courtroom took a quiet breath of something close to hope. The changes didn't take years. They came fast, because they had to. The system had been cracked open and left exposed, and now there was no going back. Bias training was mandated for every court employee, from judges to janitors. Not just a checkbox course, but a deep, repeated education in recognizing systemic inequality, in confronting internal prejudice, in learning what silence had allowed. For the first time, the law was being taught as a living force, not just as ink on a page. Public dashboards were launched, updated in real time. They displayed sentencing data, who received what punishment for which offense, broken down by race, gender, and income. It was uncomfortable at first. The numbers didn't lie, and what they revealed demanded a reckoning. But that was the point. Truth, once seen, could not be unseen, and in that discomfort, there was finally motion. Community oversight panels were formed, but these were not symbolic gestures. They had teeth, subpoena power, the ability to investigate, to question, to demand records. For the first time, citizens, many of whom had once been subjects of courtroom decisions, were sitting in judgment of the system that had judged them. Kendrick watched all of it unfold with quiet resolve. He didn't seek praise. He had never been driven by accolades. He simply continued his work, reviewing cases, mentoring young attorneys, showing up in spaces where his presence once raised eyebrows but now commanded respect. His voice, calm and measured, had become a guide for others walking into rooms once tilted against them. At a law school seminar weeks later, he stood in front of a crowded auditorium. Students leaned forward, notebooks open, laptops glowing. A young woman raised her hand. Her voice trembled just slightly. "How do we fix it?" she asked. Kendrick paused before answering. He wasn't one to give rehearsed speeches. He spoke from experience, from memory, from scars. "Listen," he said. "Not just to laws, not just to rules. Listen to the clerk who keeps notes in the margins, to the bailiff who stays quiet even though he sees everything, to the kid in the back row who thinks no one sees him. That's where the system breaks, and that's where we start fixing it." There was a hush in the room, not the silence of disinterest but of reflection. Months passed, seasons began to change. Courtrooms shifted from tension to transparency. There were still challenges, there always would be, but the fear that had once hovered over every decision, the fear of speaking up, had been weakened. And then, one morning, Kendrick returned to the very courtroom where it had all begun. He hadn't planned it as a pilgrimage, just another day in his schedule. But as he walked up the same stone steps, he noticed the crowd was gone. Not from apathy, but from trust. The cameras were gone, the protesters had gone home, and in their place was quiet confidence. He reached the door, paused, and looked to the right. A plaque had been installed, simple stainless steel, etched with 6 words, "Equal justice starts here." He ran his fingers across the lettering, no fanfare, no name beneath it, just a principle, one that people had fought for, shouted for, and finally begun to believe in. Inside, the courtroom felt lighter. The wood had been polished. Whitman's old bench gleamed under the morning light that streamed through cleaned windows. The American flag in the corner stood taller. The space hadn't changed in structure, but its spirit had shifted. As Kendrick turned to leave, he felt a tug on his arm. An elderly black man dressed in a faded suit and tie stood beside him. His hand was calloused, grip firm, eyes full. "I've been coming here 40 years, the man said. "Watched too many of us walk in afraid. Today feels different." Kendrick didn't speak right away. He nodded, and in that gesture there was a shared understanding, not of victory, but of movement, of something long overdue. Outside, the sun was climbing, cutting through the oak trees that framed the courthouse lawn. Spring had arrived, soft and determined. Kendrick stepped into the light and paused. He took one deep breath, not as a man who thought the battle was over, but as one who knew that change had taken root. The work was not finished. It never would be. There were still judges resistant to reform, still lawyers clinging to the old ways, still cases where bias crept in like a shadow. But something irreversible had happened. The tide had turned. It was no longer enough for justice to be a performance. It had to be a promise. And that promise had been written in court records, in whispered testimonies, in the ink of Kendrick's notebook, in the courage of a clerk, and the quiet bravery of a bailiff, and the words of a student who dared to ask why. And now it lived in a plaque beside a door. He walked down the steps, the same ones where reporters had once swarmed, where protest signs had waved, where truth had been shouted until it was heard. Now they were just steps, but they led somewhere new. The reckoning had not come in anger, it had come in evidence, in clarity, in standing firm when the easy choice was silence, and because of that, justice, true justice, had finally taken a seat in the courtroom. Kendrick Robinson disappeared into the day, not seeking attention, but carrying the quiet strength of knowing he had helped bend the arc, if only slightly, towards something better. If you liked this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with others so they can learn something from it too.